I think President Trump should be reminded that the only time that NATO has invoked Article 5 is in response to the attacks on the Twin Towers in Washington at 9/11.
Carney spoke about middle power countries who needed, now he argued, to find a new place in a world riddled with this unrest. Wendy Gilmour is the former Assistant Secretary General to NATO, as well as a former high-ranking Canadian diplomat, and she's with us. Hello to you, Wendy.
Hello, very good to be here. Thank you.
It's great to have you here. So the Canadian leader, Mark Carney, his speech in Davos, where he warned of a rupture, not a transition in the world order, that really made him the talk of Davos from what I've been seeing. It's time, he said, for middle countries to unite. What does that mean for you, Wendy?
I think what it means is that we have in Canada a prime minister who has a very pragmatic approach to approaching world affairs, that we can no longer count on the great powers to act in a way which is reasonable, predictable, and frankly, subject to the rules that they themselves created in establishing the United Nations at the end of the Second World War. So, I mean, what we have in Prime Minister Mark Carney, and I know the people in the UAK know him very well as your former governor of the Bank of England, is someone who has a clear view of how we have to navigate in this current situation.
Yes.
We can't wish for a world that isn't there. We have to work with the one that we have.
Okay. Is that broadly the thinking behind the Canadian decision to engage with the Board of Peace, President Trump's Board of Peace, which is being, quietly being derided? It's being publicly and widely seen as an alternative to NATO in the vision of President Trump. And it's been snubbed by China, although China will have its own reason for that. It has a seat on the permanent membership of the Security Council. But does that mean that Canada and the Canadian Prime Minister has any kind of positive view of the Board of Peace, and that's why he's there?
Well, first of all, I don't understand that we actually are there for the moment. So the Board of Peace...
You're keeping the option open, aren't you? Canada's keeping the option open, hasn't closed it off.
True. So the Board of Peace, as originally envisaged, as presented to Canada and others, was part of the arrangement for ending the war between Gaza and Israel.
Yeah.
And was supposed to manage the reconstruction of Gaza in such a way that it would ideally lay the groundwork for lasting peace. As it's now being presented in Davos, it seems to be a much more grandiose sort of replacement, not so much for NATO as a replacement for the UN and the UN Security Council.
Precisely so.
And so it's hard to understand why certainly any of the countries that are currently members of the Security Council, especially the permanent five, would, other than the US, would consider joining. Certainly for countries like Canada, we have traditionally, as an international partner, always wanted to be at the table, because you figure you could influence things if you're sitting there as opposed to being outside. But under the charter that President Trump has and his administration has circulated, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's a very strange collection of countries that have now stood up to join. And if it is more than simply resolving Palestine and Gaza, it needs a lot more study. I would, if I were still in government, I would be cautioning some reticence before joining, and certainly better understanding what are the expectations of countries that are at the table.
Yes. I mean, as you say, you only have to look at the text of the founding document of what is now the Board of Peace to see that it doesn't mention Gaza, I think, as far as I can see. What it does talk about is an ambition to engage in conflict resolution and address emergencies around the globe, precisely the role of the United Nations. If I said NATO a moment ago, forgive me, that was I misspoke. You look at the membership. It's a group of autocrats, royalty from the Gulf states. You've got not just Putin considering his options, he may well join. You've got Lukashenko of Belarus joining that body. And the credibility of this body and it's the state of the construction of its leadership is a very clear explanation for why the leaders of liberal democracies, especially in Europe, have simply turned their back on it. It's difficult to imagine Canada saying yes, surely.
Well, if you look at the charters it's written, it has almost the perpetual chairmanship of President Donald Trump in his personal capacity, not so much as President of the United States. And it seems to be set up as a reinforcement of a cult of personality, if I can describe it as such. I mean, there is no question that there is a lot of conflict in the world that needs to be addressed, that American leadership up to date has been positive in many aspects, not so positive perhaps in others. But the current behavior of the US administration, in my view, is one which does not give confidence.
Yes.
And I'm not sure that any country that would find itself under the lens of the examination of the Board of Peace may not actually welcome it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at some fresh reporting, which tells me that as of now, according to this reporting, Canada has agreed in principle to join this board. A final decision hasn't yet been taken. It would be an interesting and curious decision whether that to be the case, and we'll address that, I suppose, and we'll have a chance to do that at a later date. I just want to mention something else, if I may, in the time that we have.
Sure.
And again, thank you for coming on. It touches very directly on President Trump's attitude to NATO. Now, as you'll hear in a moment, the president has been talking about the engagement of NATO allies alongside American troops in Afghanistan in terms which has caused enormous offence to some of those with a stake in the subject. A former US commanding general said it was the most annoying, insulting thing he's heard for a very long time. I want to address with you what it tells us about the president's thinking about NATO. Just have a listen to this. He's talking about NATO in the context of Afghanistan.
I've always said, will they be there if we ever needed them? And that's really the ultimate test. And I'm not sure of that. I know that we would have been there, or we would be there. But will they be there? And let's hope that that never happens. We've never needed them. We have never really asked anything of them. They'll say they sent some troops to Afghanistan or this or that. And they did. They stayed a little back.
They stayed a little back. Now, you'll know perfectly well that in the Afghanistan conflict, the Canadian forces lost 159 service personnel, an appalling loss and sacrifice. And there's the president saying they were not needed, and those forces of the NATO allies stood back from the front line. First of all, what did you make of that? And what does it tell you about the depth of disdain that President Trump seems to feel for NATO?
I find it personally offensive, having served in and supportive of Afghanistan. I know British forces in Helmand were absolutely on the front line of some of the most difficult pieces of that conflict. Canadians in Kandahar province, similarly. I think President Trump should be reminded that the only time that NATO has invoked Article 5 is in response to the attacks on the Twin Towers in Washington at 9/11. That NATO nations were very quick to enter into Afghanistan to support the American initial led effort there. It became first a multinational and then a NATO effort in its whole. The fact that NATO went to Afghanistan in force, in numbers, allowed the Americans to continue their escapades in Iraq, joined by Britain in that instance, but very clear that the Allies have been alongside and in support of what the American-led efforts we're supposed to be supporting international peace and security, but it's horrific if they forget the sacrifices that were made by NATO members in support of their objectives.
Really, really good to talk to you. Thank you. Wendy Gilmour there.
My
former
pleasure.
Senior Canadian diplomat and Assistant Secretary General to NATO.